I'd like to start by thanking everybody who made this event possible. First of all, my exceptional e-board, our ever insightful teacher advisor, and our student engagement representatives all helped organize this event into what we are so blessed that it is. I'd also like to thank the Department of Public Safety for helping maintain security and stability right here in Drumlins. And I'd certainly like to thank the university itself. As my vice president said, they're upholding their mandate of academic freedom and ignoring the calls for the event to be canceled, and we appreciate that very much. I'd be remiss as well if I did not thank our national organization, the College Republicans of America, who were able to fund this event after the Students Association denied our budget for ideological reasons. Their generosity and the generosity of our donors is what made all of this possible. And of course, I have to thank our guest tonight, Mrs. Sara Stockton. She has graciously agreed to share her firsthand experience and her genuinely unique expertise with us here tonight. Mrs. Stockton is a licensed marriage and family therapist, a lecturer, a researcher, presenter, and a clinical supervisor of a psychotherapy group in central New York. In 2012, she co-authored and published one of the very first mental health assessments to utilize youth's readiness to begin medical treatment for gender transition. And Mrs. Stockton spent the first part of her career as a clinician treating and advocating on behalf of youth and families surrounding issues with gender. She spent time traveling in order to teach in medical facilities, physicians, and schools, teaching them how to provide what we now refer to as gender-confirming care. She treated well over 100 families, and she wrote many of the first letters that were used to approve gender transition surgeries on minors. However, due to many concerns with the treatment outcomes of these treatment ideas and how this ideology was being presented to children, she shifted her focus away from working primarily with this population. More recently, Ms. Stockton was interviewed for a popular documentary, What is a Woman?, to discuss some of the implications of what is happening developmentally to our children. Since appearing in that documentary, Ms. Sara Stockton receives constant emails and calls from medical professionals all across the globe, all sharing their fears about speaking out about these issues and their fears about the lack of conversation surrounding this very serious topic. And that's why we're here today, to start to remedy that lack of a conversation. So, of course, thank you to her, because without her, none of us would have any reason to be here tonight. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you who are here tonight, both in the audience and the many people on stream. I know it's been a bumpy ride with the security concerns forcing us to change plans, the bad weather, and the changing rules. We know that you've gone through a lot to be here, and your flexibility is massively appreciated. You being here shows that there are still some in our generation who are actually intellectually curious. It shows that there are some that have a respect for free discourse and are not cowed by social pressure. Without you and without those watching online, there'd be no reason to hold this event at all. Truly, every time we put on one of these events, my optimism for the future of the country is renewed. And because of that, because of the storm we've weathered to make this event happen, it has not discouraged us. Instead, it's just fueled our passion to continue to promote free discussion and to promote truth, as the storm that we've gone through has done nothing but show us how much that sort of thing is desperately needed. So without any further ado, I'd like to promote some of that more free discourse and promote some more of that kind of truth. So I give you Syracuse alumna, social media firebrand, and gender expert, Mrs. Sara Stockton.
Hello, thank you. Oh, I forgot this is not even working. I don't need this. Hello, thank you everyone for being here and everyone that's here online. Yeah, my name is Sara Stockton, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist locally here in central New York. I just wanted to start today. This is actually an example of a picture that's on the subways in New York City. It says, "No bigotry, hatred, or prejudice allowed at this station at any time. Reminder, respect trans people or your pronouns will be was, were." I picked that because, as many of you know and probably read the petition from Dr. Coulthart, who I worked with, published with, and was supervised with, and one of my main mentors in life, I would like to respond to her statement. There is no one I care more about than gender nonconforming kids. These are the kids who were similar to me when I was young, and who I'm extremely protective of. Suicide indoctrination and suicide extortion, like Dr. Coulthart is engaging in, is extremely harmful to vulnerable young people. And as while it serves the university's politics to promote the possibility of someone killing themselves, in the end, it's the dysphoric young person who suffers because of Dr. Coulthardt's misinformation. We know, as many social scientists warn, of the contagion effect following public discussions of suicide that happened after the release of 13 Reasons Why, the movie. We saw a dramatic increase in suicide. That's why conversations around suicide need to be handled with great care. I know and care a lot about dysphoric young people, and we are engaging in the lowest level of problem solving if we can't find a way to talk about this and to help children other than having them straight on a path to medicalization. Never would I have imagined that I would ever be speaking at a Republican event. If you told me this 15 years ago, I would have told you, yes, I would be outside with them. And for sure, growing up in Western New York by immigrant parents, I was raised as a Democrat, a diehard liberal. One of the terminology that I've been calling myself lately is a lefter G, meaning I no longer had a space in the liberal arena. Today, I'm here to talk about a few things. First, I'm going to give you a general background to the history of gender, nationally and globally, in terms of the shifts that we've been seeing and recognizing over the past decades. Then I will go into my story, what I started to see in my practice, and what led me to this place today, speaking out about my concerns regarding youth transition and calling for a more developmental approach to assessment. Finally, I will talk about some of the reasons I believe I may have fallen for this ideology and how we can continue to speak out about this dialogue, or any issue for that matter. We'll explore what we are currently seeing in terms of trends and shifts in this issue and explore what we may need to think about moving forward. Let's first start with some basic information on the history of gender transition and how we ended here. Medical transition was incredibly rare until the 20th century. In the early 1930s, the first sexual reassignment surgery were documented in Germany. Then in 1952, Christian Jorgensen gained recognition as being the first American to be publicly known to be transsexual. In 1945, Christine Jorgensen was drafted into the U.S. Army during World War II. After she served as a military clerical worker, she learned about sexual reassignment surgery being done in Europe, and she ended up traveling there and bringing back the doctors and became the instant celebrity and used the platform to advance transgender people. In the 1950s and 1960s, clinicians such as John Money and Robert Stoller developed a theory that is now known as gender identity theory, based on their work with people with differences of sexual development, also known as DSDs, or commonly intersex people. Gender identity theory essentially means that biological sex and gender roles develop independently. The premise of their theory was based on the flawed notion that some people with certain DSDs were between sexes and such children should be raised as either gender. These physicians believed that children could be socialized to be either a boy or a girl, and some parents of infants of DSDs were advised to raise their children as the opposite sex based on the appearance of genitalia alone. Doctors in these days routinely perform genital surgery on children with DSDs to make genitals appear more typical. However, we have very tragic outcomes from these. Many people have ended up killing themselves from this, and it eventually became unethical, and they stopped the work that they were doing. Today, clinicians no longer offer advice like this to parents of intersex children, and they are typically provided with information about the child's condition and a recommendation that they are raised according to their biological sex. Nevertheless, this really started the conversation about how gender is more of a social construct that could be separate from your biological sex. Then in the 1960s and 70s, this is where we see a rise of transition surgeries out of the gender identity theory. We also get introduced to German-American endocrinologist and sexologist, Dr. Harry Benjamin, who sought to improve what we now know as transgender healthcare. In 1966, Dr. Benjamin published the landmark book, The Transsexual Phenomenon, establishing himself as an authority in the world of gender. Some years later, in the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, published its first standards for care in transsexuals. And in 2007, that organization was renamed what we now know as the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH. At this time, WPATH's position on transgender healthcare was unchallenged, and arguably because there was very few people working in this field and very few people actually identifying as wanting to become the opposite sex. In 1970s, Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore became the first academic institution in the United States to offer gender-affirming surgery, and soon after we start seeing about 8 or so in those years other places opening transgender clinics, such as University in St. Louis, University of Colorado, and University of Stanford University. Whoops, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. In 1980, transsexual and gender identity disorder of childhood were both recognized as illnesses in the American Psychiatric Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. In 1998, the providers in the Netherlands recognized the importance of preventing the progression of a gender incongruent puberty by using a gonadotropin hormone-releasing hormone analog, puberty blockers, followed by treatment with either testosterone or estrogen to bring physical characteristics into alignment with a patient's gender identity. This approach was first published by Dr. Cohen and Van Goosen in 1998 in a case report of an adolescent who was treated with puberty blockers. This is the protocol that is referenced and used as the basis for the publication that I later co-author and to assess youth's readiness for transition. This was the first program geared to treating adolescents, and this was happened in Netherlands. These guidelines were based on the adult transgender guidelines that stated patients could undergo a comprehensive assessment in order to establish a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, then called gender identity disorder, and then be initiated with the treatment of puberty blockers, typically at Tanner stage 2 to 3 to pause puberty development. Just for your reference, Tanner stage 2 can be anywhere between ages of 9 and 12, depending if it's boy or girl. The rationale was that at the time spent under pubertal suppression would be used to further explore their gender identity prior to committing to estrogen and testosterone and their physical effects. This intervention with puberty blockers was also used as somewhat of a diagnostic aid, in that if it eased the distress, it was reasonable to correlate the distress with gender dysphoria as the primary cause. This was followed by hormone therapy around the age of 16 and then gender-affirming genital surgery at 18 years or later. In 2007, the Dutch protocol, as we refer to it, was adopted by practitioners internationally. So it wasn't until Dr. Norman Spack, having traveled to the Netherlands, actually brought that protocol in the US, formally opened their first gender clinic for adolescents at Boston's Children's Hospital. It should be noted here, just adolescents across the United States were already being treated for this, just not under a specific structured protocol. They would go on to publish a crucial paper in 2011 asserting that if young people with gender dysphoria were able to avoid their natural puberty by blocking it with pharmaceuticals, following by receiving opposite sex hormones, they could start living their transgender lives earlier and more credibly. In 2008, I entered graduate school for marriage and family therapy, where I had the ability to join the transgender specialty team. At Syracuse University and through their clinic, they were already known for publishing a mental health assessment for clinicians to help utilize adults' readiness for hormones. Through their work with transsexual adults, we slowly started seeing and treating the youth population. Keep in mind, when we were seeing these youth, we were receiving weekly supervision with a team to present cases in order to discuss issues such as informed consent and comorbidities. I graduated in 2010, and I continue to work and advocate primarily for the transgender community. In 2013, the clinical tool for assessing youth's readiness for gender transition that we had developed was published in the Journal of Marital and Family Therapy. I was seeing a great deal of transgender clients, and I would start going to schools, being the first ones to advocate for what was needing to go on to support these youth in school settings. I would continue education in this topic by attending conferences and seeking training from specialists in the field like the famous Marcy Bowers. I also traveled providing continuing education on the best practices for working with transgender patients in the medical field. My personal and professional life was centered around being an ally and an advocate for best practices for this community. It still is. Even as a faculty in a university, I led the way in providing ideas for how to support transgender students in the college setting. So what happened? Like I stated, I graduated university and continue to work with the transgender community and specifically with the youth. Over the years, though, I started to recognize important shifts and changes in culture and in the mental health profession. For one, and this was definitely a noticeable shift, was just the increase in the identification among youth in particular. On top of that, I had a caseload with a variety of sexual or gender-related concerns that did not exactly fit into this neat box of how we were understanding gender identity. Not to mention the impact from social media and popular culture. I never could have anticipated just what our youth would be brought up being exposed to and what impact that may have on them. And finally, I would end up facing a lot of loss and tragedies that would have me pivoting my focus away from transgender youth. Excuse me. So when I started working in this field, I don't think I realized how complex this was in terms of being influenced by politics, policy, and other stakeholders in the field of gender medicine. Planned Parenthood and even the passing of the Affordable Care Act dramatically shifted the landscape and how we were focused on the medicalization of this population. Let's start with Planned Parenthood. In 2005, the first Planned Parenthood affiliate began providing hormone replacement therapy for transgender patients. Planned Parenthood has impacted care a lot, and I'm going to read from a recent news article where they discuss the impact of Planned Parenthood treating transgender patients. This was an article that was just released last month. I have always been a very strong supporter of Planned Parenthood and am pro-choice, said Laura Edwards Leeper, who co-founded the nation's first pediatric gender clinic at Boston Children's Hospital in 2007. But they have taken on something that they are not equipped to handle. The lack of gatekeeping is so bad, she added, that some of her patients received hormones from Planned Parenthood before even coming to her for an assessment. This article highlights Fred, a young adult recently diagnosed with autism, who after cycling through many obsessive viewpoints in his childhood began to identify as transgender. Hyper-aware that this could be a phase driven by his developmental issues, Fred's parents tried to enroll him in the Gender and Autism program at the Children's National Hospital, one of the only clinics in the United States specializing in autistic youth. But the clinic has a wait list of a year. So shortly after his 18th birthday, and when his parents were out of town, Fred visited Planned Parenthood. It only took 39 minutes for Planned Parenthood to fill Fred's estrogen prescription at CVS. Instead of months-long evaluation by expert psychiatrists, a nurse practitioner had, in a little over 30 minutes, prescribed Fred a powerful drug without his mother's or father's knowledge or consent. The article continues to state, it's criminal what Planned Parenthoods are doing all over the country. Fred's mother, a New Jersey pediatrician, said, and most people have no idea this is happening. Fred's story, corroborated through nursing and medical board complaints, locational data, prescriptions, text messages, emails, and other documents reviewed by the Free Beacon, shows just how this is a microcosm of how the nation's largest abortion provider is eroding the already thin guardrails on gender medicine in America. I want you to realize that I'm reading an article that was written this year, but I could have written this article any time within the past 10 years. Because of waitlists at most mental health clinics, many young people are using Planned Parenthood to skip the line and circumvent safeguards for these youth. More recently, Planned Parenthood themselves declared that they are the second largest provider of hormonal injections in America. I continue to hear about and witness that children around the age of 16 are even able to get them without any deep consultation, after one consultation. That is something that on average took 12 to 18 months of therapy for an assessment when we were suggesting the follow protocol suggested by WPATH and the Dutch protocol. After seeing just how much of a power player Planned Parenthood became, I remember thinking, what was the point of all my research, my special training, all the expert consultations and supervision? Why does it even matter if we can just provide this sloppy care? Speaking of care, I also didn't anticipate how health insurance and those policies would actually govern my work with this population. Next came the changes in medical coverage. When I first started working with this community, medical interventions that they requested were often pricey and not always covered by insurances. However, in the period after 2010, when they passed the Affordable Care Act, it made private health insurance broadly more accessible, and both public and private payers began to remove coverage exclusions of gender-affirming care. I quickly noticed that almost every single insurance would cover the co-payments of these drugs and procedures on minors. The average cost of an implant for the hormones is $40,000 a year. It definitely changed the stakeholders. Finally, I started to notice a lot of changes to our mental health definitions and how we understood what we were treating. There are many shifts in the diagnostic definitions throughout the years that impact how we treat gender dysphoria. The WHO, who publishes the International Classification of Diseases, is a diagnostic tool that is revised on a regular basis. In 1990, the diagnosis of transsexualism was incorporated into the ICD-10. In 1994, transsexualism was substituted with gender identity disorder. There were a few shifts around during the years with the DSM-3 and 4 regarding gender, but with the arrival of the DSM-5 in 2013, there was a change in the diagnostic criteria that caused a giant shift in thinking. We renamed gender identity disorder as gender dysphoria. This is no longer perceived as a result of a disordered mindset. It was about self-expressed distress. Obviously, I started to see a lot of problems with people trying to self-diagnose. We don't realize that we can't prescribe these so-called life-saving treatments to people without a diagnosis or without a code. That is how our medical systems work. We are trying to balance ways to destigmatize this condition by almost framing it as a choice or a persona that you can try on. But insurance companies do not pay for elective procedures. Therefore, in order for this to be a life-saving treatment, we need to be treating something. Hence the reason why we have the diagnosis. I do want to note something very important here. Now that I've been working with people in the medical community, and most importantly with detransitioners, we are fighting to have a code in the ICD to identify detransitioners. They go back to these clinics for support or help, and they are turned away. We have no way of identifying the next steps on how to support people seeking to reverse their medical care. There's no way to have surgeries to help you undo these procedures. The same ones that were fully covered under the premise that gender is fluid, but it seems like it only goes one way. Finally, more recently, we continue to see changes in January 2022 when the ICD-11 was released. In the most recent edition, it moved gender-related distress out of the chapter relating to mental and behavioral disorders and into the chapter entitled Conditions Related to Sexual Health. This changed the underlying assumptions around gender-relating distress from a mental and behavioral issue to a sexual health issue. So keep in mind that we are now suggesting that children as young as 2 or 3 can be diagnosed with a so-called sexual health problem. Some of the most alarming shifts in watching over the years was just how prevalent it was to see the youth transition. Keep in mind that every single one of my youth were the first ones to transition in their schools and their communities. But I started to see without fail within 3 years of a person coming out as transgender at their school, you would see at least 3 more coming out from there. Right now, you will often hear of children and youth presenting as being their 3rd or 4th individual in their friend group to transition. But we are taught not to explore that dynamic, just affirm. I will also share some of the concerning cases that I was seeing and how that shifted my trust in this field of medicine. Historically, the rates of gender dysphoria or transgender identification were very low. In 2013, the DSM-5 estimated that the incidence of gender dysphoria in adults to be at 2 to 14 per 100,000, or between 0.002% and 0.014%. However, these numbers have recently increased dramatically, particularly in adolescent populations. Some surveys suggest that between 2 to 9% of high school students now self-identify as transgender or gender nonconforming, and there's a significant increase of adolescents claiming a non-binary identity. The Williams Institute estimates that 1 in 71 teenagers, or 1.4%, identify as transgender, quite a difference of 0.002 to almost 2% of the youth population identifying as transgender in 10 years. The Gender Identity Development Service clinic at Tavistock in London, for example, saw a 20-fold increase in the last decade. So this is actually a graph from the Dutch protocol in the Netherlands. So if you notice, it starts at 2000, and the red line is assigned females. In 2000, there was almost 0 women presenting as wanting to transition. By the time we hit 2016, you can see the dramatic shift. The journalist Abigail Schreier, who wrote a book about teenage girls and the transgender craze, noted that primarily prepubescent boys and middle-aged men were the 2 groups seeking transition. This is also what I was taught in grad school. Then suddenly we have a brand new cohort of female adolescents presenting at gender clinics. She goes on to say that before 2012, in fact, there are no scientific literature on girls ages 11 to 21 ever having developed gender dysphoria at all, and now they constitute the majority. No one can really explain what happened to young girls and the shift in such a desire to transition that was almost never heard of before. Social media and culture. I never anticipated when I first wrote it just how important social media would impact their presentation and identification of self. I want you to keep in mind that the first iPhone isn't released until the end of 2007. By 2012, it's the first year that the majority of Americans even reported owning a smartphone. By 2012, it was the first time that daily social media use among teens moved from 50% daily use to 75% use. Even 10 years ago, you would feel left out if you didn't keep up with social media expectations. Recently, a study from 2018 to 2021 was released stating that 22% of 10th graders said they spent 7 or more hours a day using social media. Basically, 1/4 of teenagers state that they spend about 50% of their awake hours connected to their devices. How can that not have a significant impact on their development and how they are forming ideas about themselves? I also didn't realize that we would never be able to measure the impact of popular culture and how this is being presented to our young children. In 2007, we were introduced to Jazz Jennings, where she was interviewed by Barbara Walters at the age of 6 to discuss her gender identity, and we were introduced to the girl born in the wrong body. In 2015, the show I Am Jazz premieres on TLC. Jazz, who was born male, at age 4 was diagnosed with gender dysphoria, making her one of the youngest publicly documented in popular culture. With all this information being presented to this youth, I started to be curious about the social contagion impact due to such a rapid increase of youth presenting with gender dysphoria in adolescence without a presentation or any issues reported in childhood. Because of this, I started looking at social contagions, something that we did cover in some of my psychology courses. The sociologist Herbert Blumer coined the phrase social contagion with examples from history such as the dancing mania in the Middle Ages. Of course, there are many other examples of contagions throughout history. Researchers admit, when looking at social contagions, that as humans, we possess an inherent vulnerability to being influenced by others, particularly by those with whom we share a sense of connection. It is notable, however, that social contagions happen more often among youth, and especially females. Researchers believe that females often struggle more from this because of their excessive empathy, repetitive discussion of problems, and their excessive need to seek reassurance. strange thing was that everyone around me wasn't considering this as a possible contagion or something that should even be considered, especially when multiple people were coming out in one friend group. To understand what I was seeing, in my later years of practice, I stumbled upon the physician-scientist Dr. Lisa Lippman, who in 2013 undertook research to understand what was driving the sudden sharp rise in the number of adolescent girls identifying as novel genders and seeking medical transitions. In her study of 256 parental reports of adolescents experiencing gender dysphoria, she coined the term rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ROGD, to refer to trans identification in a young person that first occurred out of the blue and after puberty, and often after the young person had spent an extended amount of time online or alongside a peer who identified as trans in real life. While Lippman and many others realize that ROGD is not a formal mental health diagnosis, this hypothesis at least proposes a viable explanation for the extraordinary rise in adolescents suddenly seeking transition and in the similarity in presentation. Keep in mind that according to the Dutch protocol, which we modeled our assessment over, there was an emphasis that the child should have presented distress around their gender at a younger age in order to be considered for medical intervention. So right now I'm going to talk about the complexities I started seeing. I see all types of patients, including ones with different paraphilias and kinks such as cross-dressers. Many of my cross-dresser clients have no desire to transition or to take anything medically to support their desires. Then I was introduced to a man who identified as autogynephilic. I had never heard of this term before because it was almost erased in the literature due to its controversial claims. This was never taught to me in school, and again, most people are unaware of how this could be relevant to the transgender community. In 1989, psychologist Ray Blanchard proposed his theory of autogynephilia, basically claiming that there are two fundamentally distinct types of trans women, each with a different sexual orientation-related cause. He described this as a male's propensity to be sexually aroused by the thought of himself as female. Again, this is a controversial topic, but this is how my client was identifying himself. I started to read the literature about people presenting with an intense admiration for women. People report, "I love women so much I wanted to be one." However, they do admit now that the more you search into those desires, the less worth you may find in being the gender that you are. Because of this, they may start to develop a repulsion towards their own gender, causing them to be more likely to transition. I continue to see primarily young men talk about their sexual desire to see themselves as women and how pornography is influencing this younger generation. Another alarming thing that started happening and what I was seeing in my room was just how many youth were also diagnosed or considered to be on the autism spectrum. This should raise a lot of red flags for us in the medical professions in terms of how we are not considering this as an important factor when treating someone with gender dysphoria. For example, the Tavistock Clinic in the UK that is going to be shut down found out that out of 1,000 youth, 35% of them had moderate to severe autism. This is including the percentage of people that may have been considered severe or just mild. And in 2015, Boston Children's Clinic reported that 23% of young people presenting with gender dysphoria at the clinic there had possibly, likely, or very likely Asperger's syndrome, even many with a previous diagnosis. And then I would come and be introduced to what they call a detransitioner many years ago. To detransition or to detest means to stop the process of transition or go back to living as your biological sex. It's important to note that many detransitioners are still not comfortable with that term because it still places them in a gender box. Some like to refer to themselves as medically injured. So I was introduced to my first detransitioner when several years ago, when I had my client who identified as a gay male during our time come back to me. And when he came back to me, he was completely unrecognizable. He had complete facial reconstruction surgery, sexual reconstruction surgery, and I honestly had to hold back my shock when I had to hear about his story of complete medical mistreatment. Only learning to find out that there are many stories like his where gay men in particular get lured into the culture of prostitution and are told that they would make more money if they were transgender or shift their identity. That's just one example of the many horrible stories of misguided support that ends up in a lot of grief. But that would just be the beginning into learning what may come for anyone that decides that they want to return to living as their biological sex. Detransitioners are dealing with a whole subset of concerns that we are just beginning to learn about. Many of these youth are part of that first-time experiment. Finally, I came across cases where you found that perhaps narcissistic parent claiming their transgender's child identity more than the child themselves. And then it came when I started witnessing the courts stripping away the parents with valid concerns the right to decide the treatment for their children. These decisions are based on interventions that are experimental at best. This ended very badly for parents, and I can no longer stand and be a part of a system that didn't listen to any opinion other than let's move straight towards sterilization of this child. So what happened next? So what did I do with all this information, all my concerns? Did anyone around me seem to care or agree with me? At least in my little local bubble, everything seemed to be still going towards affirmation without any questions. By 2016, I could no longer be confident that clients were receiving the best informed care around these practices with the concerning case presentations, especially the rate of youth with autism requesting dramatic interventions. So I just started slowly moving my practice to more sex therapy. I was already seeing clients with different concerns, and with the knowledge that I had, it made it very easy to move into just sex and intimacy. Not to mention, by the time I was starting to be really concerned, the specialty I was a part of was saturated, and I was no longer one of the only trans specialists around. According to the mental health field, anyone can be able to see these clients and provide specialized care. So I called 2016 to 2022 the silent years, the years that I was just watching from the sidelines. I stopped seeing these clients until the topic of gender started coming back into my room indirectly and directly from my own children's lives. I really thought that I would just stop and then I wouldn't have to deal with this issue of gender anymore for the rest of my professional career or even life. Well, God has a funny sense of humor, huh? This wouldn't be the end of my story, because my clients and my own children would be constantly coming to me with new issues and concerns about the current climate. Just a small example was my son, who had a friend that started to identify as the other gender at the age of 9. My son was very confused as he never heard of the term transgender, and at school they just walked in one day and said that his friend that he knew as a boy since kindergarten is now a girl. He naturally asked me, did he grow a vagina over the summer? Mom, how do I know that I am a boy? How do you know you are a girl? How do I know that I am not next, or that next week that I'm not going to become a girl? He was terrified and he was confused. He also cared about his friend. And I was just blown away by his questions and what my clients were bringing up in my room. Before I go to the next slide, I just want to warn everyone, give you a little bit of a trigger warning. What is a woman? So yes, this is here. I am with Matt Walsh. This is where I decided I can no longer sit back and say nothing. And yes, he smiles. Like I stated before, I was silent for a long time, but I couldn't seem to escape gender ideology and its impact on everyone and how I was a part of this for so long. Early in 2022, a client of mine sent me a clip of Matt Walsh on Dr. Phil. I had never heard of him before, which was honestly probably a good thing. I sent him a message about my background that night and just concerns as a therapist who had had a big influence in the field. The documentary was already complete, it was already filmed, but I ended up being the last one interviewed. I never made it into the book that he wrote about the documentary, and even in the documentary themselves, even though it was a 2-hour interview, they never go into how deep I was involved in this. I had maybe 3 minutes of airtime in total. I also just want to bring attention to some of the people in these pictures, especially over here, Paulina and Selena and Deborah So, because I think these people really changed my viewpoint on being able to speak out and about being brave. I obviously never cared about, women's sports until I met them. I know that sounds weird, but after spending a long time with them, especially Selena, hearing their stories about practicing their whole life and getting up at 6 a.m. years after years and getting their titles stripped away from them by a biological male was just beyond anything I'd ever heard. And I think it's something that we don't talk about enough. Everything that they worked for was stripped away from them. And then finally, Dr. Jordan Peterson, clinical psychologist and podcast, he was speaking out against clinicians who participated in youth transition. He ended up writing an essay called Butchers and Liars, in which he called for people like me to be put away into prison and for what we have been a part of, and hence the reason why I reached out to him in order to do the in order to do this podcast. In the aftermath. After the documentary, I was contacted by so many professionals expressing their concerns about this issue and their fears with speaking out. These emails were from all types of professionals: therapists, anesthesiologists, geneticists, medical doctors. After the documentary came out, I started receiving a lot of calls from people to consult and speak on their podcasts, and from all over the world. Right here, I don't know if you can see my picture, that is a newspaper from Japan, as I've been helping people from Japan, Singapore, and Italy deal with this because they're seeing a dramatic increase with their youth. All of these countries are asking for support, and I've learned so much since speaking out. I get to meet pioneers in the field like Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist from Ireland who started GenSpect and who's been helping figure out what's going on and be able to question the evidence. Questioning the evidence. When I started to work with the youth, we believed that we were providing a pathway to help children perhaps pause puberty while they figure out their gender identity. I didn't realize that we'd be offering a treatment that almost exclusively set a child on the path towards medicalization. The statistics vary. However, almost all children, 95 to 98%, prescribed puberty blockers go on to cross-sex hormones. The prescribing of puberty blockers virtually eliminates the possibility of desistance. Therefore, we should consider ethically that a decision to put a child on puberty blockers must be considered as the equivalent to the decision to put a child on cross-sex hormones. Then you need to be able to understand the informed consent and other considerations implicit in that decision. Even now, we have students being taught here that there are absolutely no side effects to these medications. Yet, when I take the same medication myself for fertility reasons, I am made well aware of the side effects. There isn't a medication on the planet without side effects, let alone a long-term study on the impact of puberty blockers being used on the youth. Evidence being released recently has been a large reason why they are pausing medicalization of youth in other countries. That's what makes me so uncomfortable, is the lack of transparency and honesty about these procedures and what's happening to our youth. As I started to look deeper into the field, I realized that several of the studies that we used as talking points were actually not really reliable studies at all. For example, for a long time, we were told that there was a male brain and a female brain. Activists use this to state that so-called trans brains end up looking similar to the sex of the brain they are identifying as. Although the brains of males and females exhibit small average differences in both size and structure, there's nevertheless considerable overlap between the sexes. The idea that someone could possess a brain that does not align with their sex makes no biological sense. Even if we were used an MRI to indicate that an individual had brain structures more akin to those typical of the opposite sex, it would not imply that they literally have an opposite sex brain. By the same logic, my big feet would not be considered male feet. One study frequently cited to support the brain sex hypothesis is when researchers recruited 72 participants, 24 males, 24 females, and 24 transgender women, all who underwent MRI imaging. These images were then subjected to a machine learning algorithm designed to predict sex, which it did reasonably accurately. From the machine learning data, a brain sex index was created, BSI, with a BSI of 0, meaning a standardized to represent a totally female brain, and a BSI of 1 to represent a totally male brain. So a 0 graded brain typically represented a female brain, and a 1 represented a male brain. When applied to the transgender women, the BSI indicated a shift of 25% toward the female end, although remaining much closer to typical male brains being represented as 1. However, 6 out of the 24 transgender participants were attracted to members of the same sex. Why would this be important? As it turns out, several lines of evidence suggest that homosexual individuals have less sexually dimorphic brains than heterosexuals. This, to show exactly how sexual orientation can affect research on gender dysphoria, one study scanned the brains of 24 heterosexual male to female transsexuals, meaning males identifying as women who are attracted to females, and compared them with male and female heterosexuals and found no signs of brain feminization. Studies claiming that brains of transgender identifying individuals are shifted toward the opposite sex routinely do not control for homosexuality. I could go on and on about the studies that are coming out about this treatment on minors, as well as the insufficient studies that have been used to underpin all of WPATH's guidelines and how we medically intervene with our children. Nevertheless, we're not able to question the evidence. However, if you want to advance the field and provide the next best care for this population, we need to be able to test the evidence. Well, a lot of people ask me what I think it will take for things to change in the United States and with the healthcare and with the youth. The answer is I don't know what it's going to take, but I would like to think that things are starting to change now. I'm trying to remain optimistic about people being able to speak out, like organizations such as the LGBT Courage Alliance, Therapy First, GenSpec, SEGM, and Fair Medicine, to continue to engage on all levels of reform to change what's happening. If you notice, more recently, in 2021, after being the first to adapt the Dutch protocol, the Netherlands decided to no longer support gender transition, especially through the use of puberty blockers. In a recent conference that I was at in New York City, I was able to meet people who started the Finland protocol and were working it in the height of their transition, who realized just how harmful this was to children. Then in Sweden, decided in February 2022 to halt hormone therapy for minors except in very rare cases, and most famously, the upcoming closing of the Tavistock Clinic in UK's decision to limit the use of puberty-suppressing drugs to children. All of this, according to them, is due to 1, an inadequate evidence base, 2, an inappropriate medical authority exerted over a primarily society ethics issue, and 3, an inadequate process used to design the protocol. Finally, medical authorities in France, Australia, and New Zealand have all recently this year issued strong statements highlighting the uncertainties and experimental nature of affirming interventions. This is the United States. Currently, we are starting to see states pass legislation about limiting the youth's access to transgender care in terms of medicalization. If you will look at this map, you will notice that New York State is a shield state, meaning that it will protect access to transgender health care. Almost half of the states are at least considering best practices for the youth, and we expect to see that continue as time goes. We do have to be considerate about how we shift and consider to move forward with the youth. More recently, I was able to get close to Jamie Reed, who was a whistleblower at a gender clinic in Missouri, who worked at the clinic, who started to be very alarmed about what she was seeing. Many whistleblowers are coming forward. Not to mention, there are about 20 cases currently about to be brought to court from detransitioners against the medical professionals who treated them. Just 2 days ago, a famous detransitioner called Shape is suing the first clinic in Boston for what he said was medical malpractice due to him being homosexual. The first of these lawsuits happened in the UK, and we are still building a precedent for these cases. I am telling you that a lot of things will continue to change, especially with sports and being able to deal with that with the youth. So why am I here today and sharing my story, and what do I want you to get from it? Everyone asks me what we do next and how do we stop what's happening to our youth. I think this topic is as relevant to me as anyone in this room in terms of being able to look around and trust and ask questions, especially when you are a part of something. First and foremost, we need to continue to speak out. I'm here today and I am a part of a lot of organizations that work together to address these concerns. I didn't realize I have people out there. The amount of emails I get and people that send me messages thanking me for my courage in speaking out surprises me. I appreciate that, and people will appreciate you for speaking out. It takes a lot of courage, but we can start by having small conversations. No matter what the topic is, if you have concerns, you have to be able to speak out to those around you. We have to value and live in a world that appreciates open communication and dialogue. It wasn't easy for me to be here today. I've been fired from 2 jobs. I received an email today that I was let go from the local facility that I work at. But I'm here, and I still don't care if I'm being punished for speaking out. I'm not willing to live in a world where you aren't able to have open communication and the capacity to actually question the evidence. We have been taught since grade school that the science is about being able to replicate a study. The science is not determined on this. You should question any field that is not able to provide a space for advancement and a thorough assessment on the current trends and shifts. I also want to mention that your support system is so crucial. I wouldn't have gone on the documentary and even started speaking out without a lot of support and conversations with my very close friends, especially my close friends who identify as transgender or from other marginalized communities. I wanted to make sure that my worries about the youth were not far off. Almost every reasonable person I speak with can understand why I have concerns about what I am seeing. Yet I am unable to speak about it in a public setting without extreme backlash and being called transphobic. Next, we need to be aware of the chain of trust. For example, in the field of medicine, it is obvious that the amount of information needed or available to successfully treat patients is massive. So you have to trust that someone has done the research, that a group of thoughtful, rational people have taken the time to determine what the best course of action should be. As a student, you may not have the time to read the original papers that back up the treatment plan you're being taught, or even know the research that may be hidden for some reason. For me, I don't blame my supervisors or faculty members for what we were doing in 2008. We all had the same information at the time. It was new, and it was dictated by a lot of different factors. But what I don't quite understand is how even now, some people aren't recognizing and seeing what many other professionals are starting to see. Instead, they are just doubling down. To be honest, I am here today because that same person who doesn't want me to speak taught me to speak out for that marginalized child. I just know that each child can be complex, and there isn't one way to treat anything in mental health. There isn't any other situation I know of where puberty blockers or hormones are the first-line treatment for suicidality. Dr. Levine, a famous psychologist who has worked in the field of gender for decades, recently described young doctors and psychologists confidently telling him how gender dysphoria is to be treated. He stated that they were so confident because this is what they were taught in medical school or graduate school. They were operating based on 100% trust. That's what I was operating on almost 15 years ago. Now, these people, these counselors, they're treating the next generation. We know that there are issues and concerns with the evidence, yet every major medical organization in the United States will swear up and down in a court of law that the science on this is settled. Yet we also have research that states when children present with gender dysphoria, the vast majority, upward to 87%, will grow out of it and continue to live according to their biological sex. Finally, and I know this is corny and probably stated in every other speech to young people, you have to get involved. Maybe even reach over to the other side. Coming here is a good start, but continue to figure out what is going on locally. Recently, they changed the New York State guidelines in schools that you can transition your kid without the parents' knowledge, and I wouldn't have known without paying close attention because they aren't always talking about it. You probably aren't worried about your own children now, but many of you will find out that you'll need to know what's happening in the world around your children. The information being introduced to our children now is so radically different from what I was taught and what you were even taught. You need to get involved in your community in any way and start providing a voice of reason and logical change. Be bold, but also have compassion. Also, regardless of the political party or viewpoints, we have to work with people from all areas of life. I never would have been here today without finding Matt Walsh. I never thought I would have anything in common with him, or a reason to have a conversation with someone considered so far right. But those conversations changed the way I started to listen to all my conversations preceding that. So don't forget that if you go too far right, you will end up far left. We will have to continue to work across political parties if you want to actually get things done. There are issues in life that are so important to both parties, such as being able to provide for your family and having the authority to raise your children according to your values and beliefs. Get involved in your school board meetings and ask questions to your faculty members that you are afraid to ask. Even if it's private, ask a mentor to help formulate your assumptions. I want to thank you again for allowing me to speak, and I hope you have learned something today about the history of gender ideology in the youth. Never stop having conversations, and please continue to share the concerns of pushing gender nonconforming children into medical decisions that they may not have the information needed or the developmental capacity in order to make an informed decision.
All right. Thank you very much. That was awesome. This now begins the Q&A portion. I have a couple of questions that have already been texted to me or are already in the live stream. But if anybody here has a question for Ms. Stockton, you do indeed get first dibs. If you agree or disagree, please. Want clarification on anything, come on up. If not, I will be the proxy for all of our people online who have questions. So right now, come up if anybody has anything. If not, I will read. Okay. I was texted one from a friend who is asking, who says, one of the things that I hear a lot is that if we do not affirm minors who feel as if they are in the wrong body, that they are much more likely to commit suicide. That what you are saying is literally violence. I never know how to respond to that. How would you respond to that?
Okay. Yeah. All right, so first of all, I would say that the research on this is very limited at best in terms of actually being able to assess suicidality among transgender youth. Not to mention that there is definitely a difference between thinking about suicide and actually attempting suicide. Activists claim that the higher rates of identification is due to the acceptance, but also claim that suicidality comes from social hostility and lack of acceptance. When researchers compared youth with similar mental health profiles, the disparities in suicidal behavior reduced considerably, suggesting that it's not the lack of gender affirmation that seems to be driving suicidal behavior. Meaning a lot of these gender dysphoric youth have many comorbidities, so when you do look at it, we do not see a difference in the suicidality. And I would also like to say that there is no studies that have come anywhere close to showing a level of causality. That if you don't have, there's no way to check if someone doesn't have access to gender affirming care that they will then attempt suicide.
Look, there's like 100 people at home who are gonna want to hear. So
if you want to say what you're gonna say. Sorry.
No, you're fine. Do you have? I was just asking about specific studies that you have found that would prove that otherwise.
Oh, prove otherwise that it doesn't increase suicidality, or I mean, because there are studies. I mean,
no, studies that prove that not providing gender affirming care to trans and gender nonconforming youth would lead or heighten the level of suicidality amongst this population.
No.
I'm wondering. Yes.
No.
Yes.
Well, the gold standard for finding a causal relationship between affirming medicine and suicide would need to be a random controlled trial. So far to date, none have been conducted to study the effects of puberty blockers on mental health, including suicidality of gender distressed youth.
So there are studies that don't necessarily focus on exactly what you just ended with there at the end. So as we get more specificity,
Mhm.
it's going to be harder to find studies on that,
Mhm.
as it is hard to find studies on a lot of things.
Yeah.
But as somebody who graduated with a undergrad in public health,
Mm.
specializing in community health education and focusing a lot on queer health and doing work with the organizations around here that provide services to queer youth. Um, there are many services, especially as Professor Coolhart has
Mm.
mentioned in the article in the Daily Orange,
Mhm.
that do show that maybe not necessarily to get your specificity, but that it does in these,
It does what?
that it does lower the rates of suicidality.
You're unable to. How would you be able to control and know that it's from the puberty blockers?
Because, so here's the thing. So you could say that, but you could also say a lot of like other things about other
Correct.
things as well. Because these are trans youth that are sharing their stories. Right.
Right. So I could say aspirin has helped me not want to commit suicide too.
Okay. So I like your train of logic, jumping from another thing to another thing. So I can jump. I have one more question for you related to something else.
Last thing
Last thing?
for you. Yep.
Why?
Because this is Q&A, not a conversation. Unfortunately, I want to make sure other people.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah,
I'll table that question.
And
No,
you
no.
can talk to me after too. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I'll table this question for now, and then
Yeah.
I'll come back up here after you ask other questions, let other people speak.
Yeah, sure thing. All right. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah.
So I just had a quick question regarding like specifically puberty blockers, you know, increased levels of like estrogen, testosterone, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Are we seeing any current like long-term psychological effects of people like taking these drugs over an extended 5-10 year period of time? And like, if so, what are they? And can they be mitigated? Because I know that there's like, you know, some people that say that like puberty blockers and stuff can't be reversed. So can they be or can't they be? Like, I'm just trying to get an education.
Sure. I mean, so again, the research is very limited around this. So we have had research in mice done recently and research done that showed that puberty blockers in one case lowered someone's IQ of about 15 points, which is the difference between being able to be a functional adult or not. And as far as it being fully reversible, that's not true either. I mean, there are definitely long-term effects from these drugs. Again, like Lupron, I mean, which I've taken for fertility reasons, can cause a great deal of distress. And there has been I don't have it, so I don't want to quote it incorrectly, but there is a research study that actually shows that puberty blockers increase suicidality in many of the minors. And I was just talking to my friend today who's transgender. One of the things that he said is that very early on, once you're in puberty blockers, you're not even addressing suicidality. That takes a long time to even get to. In terms of the long-term side effects of taking cross-sex hormones, yeah, the youth, especially the detransitioners, I mean, if you, I wish I had it, the puberty blockers, if you start them in Tanner's stage 2, you're about 99 likelihood you won't ever achieve orgasm. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I'm just up in the mic.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm a little curious on what happens to the detransitioners when they are trying to start that process. Do they try to reverse the hormones by taking the opposite hormonal pill, so to speak, or are they just kind of forced to stop taking anything altogether by the people who give them the initial hormonal pills?
Mm-hmm. Well, unfortunately, it all depends, right? So Scott Nugent, who was on the documentary as well, female to male, transsexual. I use he, but he's comfortable with she too. He identifies as a female lesbian. He has a long-term side effects from these things, and he's trying to detransition, but according to the doctors, he will need to be on some sort of hormones for the rest of their life. So you do have detransitioners that have been able to completely just stop their hormones, but the majority of them do have to, for several years, re-engage with hormonal treatment, which again is not often covered by insurances because it's not gender-affirming care.
they would be re-engaging with the hormonal treatment they were having before, or non-reversible?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these clinics are turning these people away. They don't really know how to work with people that want to detransition, right? Shape, for example, is desperately trying to get her breast implants removed, but there's no, support for her around there. So they're often being sent away and trying to find endocrinologists that will even help them, because again, there is not a protocol to detransition at this time, but there is to transition. Yep.
So you talked a bit about the financial costs of transition, the surgery and the hormones, saying that because it's now considered elective, insurance companies now make much more on it insurance companies don't have to cover it, so that the pharmaceutical companies make much more, and the people ultimately go into more debt. So I was wondering if you have any figures or any studies on what the average medical debt of somebody who's transitioned is after going through the process.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, when I first started, and I would say like 10 years ago, it was about like $80,000 that you would go into for this. I'm unaware of what it costs now. Like I said, the implant that a lot of people are getting for hormones is $40,000 for a year. So yeah, I mean, the prices, I don't have those figures as much, but like I was talking to someone earlier, a lot of hospitals that are performing or doing gender-affirming care are in the black and not in the red because of gender-affirming care. So if these hospitals stopped providing gender-affirming care, many of them could be shut down, including Upstate Hospital close by. There's someone back there.
Yeah, sure. Coming up, ma'am. I have a question from the live stream as well, but we'll do that after you. Yeah, you gotta come closer. The wire's short. Sorry, brother.
Thank you. So just quoting some figures from some fairly recent studies. I also do give lectures on trans healthcare from time to time. So one study said that transgender youth who receive transition-related care reported less suicide ideation than transgender youth who do not receive transgender care but want it.
Do you know when they conducted that study?
It was within the last 5 years.
No, I mean, one of the big issues with these studies is how they're conducting and asking kids for stuff. So the surveys that are sent out afterwards, just kind of wondering about that.